The book I read is Ghost Ship by Ada France Williams, on the institutional racism and the Church of England.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I decided to have a look at two books. One is God Colourblind, and the other one is Black, Gay, British, Christian and Queer.
Hi, my name is Samita, and I read this book, Reading My Black, by McCaully.
So the book talks specifically about the Church of England and how it addresses institutional racism, or doesn't address institutional racism. And it talks about how the organisation is set up in a way that doesn't allow for the addressing of issues that are of interest to people of colour or ethnic minorities. And it's written by a member of the clergy, and a lot of it is around his experience or experience of other black and brown clergy within the church in facing racism or voicing their concerns about racism.
More around people's perspectives. They were always expected to follow the same line as everybody else rather than being looked upon as an individual. It highlighted a lot about how some people probably have perceived them or looked at them or treated them. To me, it was showing how they've had to try and kind of fight in a way to be recognised as human rather than, oh, there's that black person over there, or, you know, whatever, anything that people would have said, you know, because it was always based on, oh, well, look at them because they look different or whatever, rather than embracing the difference and wanting to know more.
As I said, it talks about slavery, and then it talks about how they've been controlled with the use of Bible, some of the scriptures, and leaving all that aside, how they made sure to keep up with their relationship with God. Most importantly, praying on time and reading through Bible, the scriptures, relating to it. Most importantly, interpreting it in own way, I would say, because I have not gone through any of the experience they have shared. But I can understand, if someone had to go through all of that, there is a possibility of them staying away from a religion or the Bible that have been used to keep them controlled. Because there are incidents they say, whereas when there was slavery, the slave masters had used scriptures about God to say, you need to submit, you need to listen to all that what he says, you need to submit your master. So they have used the Bible literally to control them. So having gone through all of that, what made them realize, there could be certain scriptures that people misinterpret or maybe use it for their gain, but ultimately it's about the relationship with God, and how do you maintain that and how do you look up to your salvation. So that is one of the key messages I got from the book.
It's different in the sense that it's looking specifically at the institution that is the Church of England. A lot of the sort of faith books or theology books I've read are not, they're not necessarily focused on the question of race. They're just theology as it is and how we interpret it and those kinds of applications. So for me personally, I've never really read any faith-based books from a race perspective. I've only just read them from a Christian perspective.
Books that I've read in the past have been very, this is how it is, this is what you have to do, this is how you should think, to expect, to follow what these books tell you is fact, when actually a lot of those books now, after reading these and sort of progressing with faith as a general rule, isn't the way it is, and they were not inclusive in the way that they were written, and I'm sure there's still quite a few books that probably are still like that, both from the aspects of people of colour, and like in the other book that also brings in the LGBTQ aspect to it as well, how a lot of that was kind of sidelined as we're sin, without actually doing anything that God would see as sinful. I'd like to think that maybe having better insight and learning that we can all be together. Hopefully there's a few more books now that are a little bit more open. But I do think that this is kind of showing a way of, well, actually we can all come to the table. We don't have to be seen as overly different, but to also embrace those differences at the same time. And it's all about acceptance, rather than just putting up with, because we shouldn't just put up with, we're human, and ultimately that's what we should aim for, is that we're all human.
Coming from Sri Lanka, so most of the books that I've read are mostly focused on Asians, I would say, especially about our culture, about our beliefs and our behaviors and things like that. So coming from a background of that and then reading this was at first was a bit hard for me, because I couldn't relate to any of the incidents that have been discussed in the book, and the hardships and things like that. But overall, I would say this is a good. It gave me a good window of like a different perspective for me to look at, and it was a lot of new learnings for me.
And there's actually a point in the book where he references, it says black people are people, black Christians are Christians, and black Anglicans are Anglicans. The kind of their blackness preceding the statement is almost not relevant. They're part of the group. They're not distinct from the group. So why is this sense of always trying to separate them from a group? The group is there as a diverse group, and they come with their differences, but they're still part of a whole. He does go on to kind of say that ethnic origins may lie in different places. So ethnic origins may lie in Asia, Africa, or the America. And a few of us are visitors from those lands, but mostly we ourselves are English. A large proportion of us born in England and glad to be Anglicans here in partnership with white Christians. We belong to this land and every corner of it. Make us more visible within the life and leadership of our church. Racism has no place in Christ, so let all discrimination against us, knowing or ignorant, cease. Let us reach our fullness in Christ as ourselves. Let our gifts and calling be recognized and affirmed. Our partnership in the life of the Church of England be evident and welcomed. Let the whole Church of England, by deliberate will, live this doctrine in practical love. And it was a quote from Buchanan, which is on a book called The Long View.
The same meal, different food gave me food for thought. That was in the Is God Colourblind? It sounds very much like we're talking about just food there, but I mean food can play an element, but that wasn't the basis of it. It was the fact, again, that people are brought in and you sit at a table and everybody is expected to say the same thing, do the same thing, expect the same thing, follow the same thing, without having their own individual thoughts to it. Because at the end of the day, would you ask somebody that you knew was vegan to suddenly go and eat meat? You wouldn't. You wouldn't expect that, and that's a given. Well, why would you then expect somebody of colour to conform to something that's not quite sitting right with them? And from the other book, the one that stood out was we need to think through our theologies of God and how our theology of God impacts our understanding of each other. And again, it brings it back to all the years that religion has been. This is what you need to do, this is what you should think, this is how you should pray, all these kind of things. And all the areas of people that weren't allowed to be part of that.
Okay, so there's this piece they talk about John's scripture, what John has written about submitting their masters, so which the author doesn't agree to. He's like, okay, they always talk about, agree to all the hardships that you have to go through and then don't speak against them, submit and all of that. So John goes on and on about it. But at the same time, he talks a bit different about the political perspectives as well. So the author says We could look at it from perspective where they're being asked to do whatever they've been said without questioning whatsoever. But at the same time, he also takes scriptures from Luke and he highlights and says, alternatively, Luke talks about, what Jesus has done in terms of not listening to what the government says, but then, maintaining a relationship with God. So there's interesting debate. So there are a lot of interesting quotes. So he talks about what he doesn't agree at the beginning, and then he took scriptures from where he agrees and where he kind of explains and says, it's not about just one piece of literature that you take from Bible. It's you take the literal meaning of the whole book. Biblical peacemaking is the cessation of hostilities between nations and individuals as a sign of God's inbreaking kingdom. It's about deciding on things. I mean, there are a lot of conversations I've heard about taking the Bible literally, or how to do it, or just read through and take whatever applies to you. But this is like, it's a journey. It's not just, you read something, pick that out and then interpret the way you want. It's about a whole experience it talks about there.
In my personal opinion, I felt that he had very high expectations, and that was quite sad. I was already like, well, how are we going to change an institution that's been around for so long with this premise? And how do you do that already knowing that your voice is being sort of silenced because you're not, you don't tick, you're not doing it in the right way, or we haven't given you the space. How dare you try to kind of question things? So I found him quite bold. I don't know that I would do it. I'm not sure I would. I'd just be like, yeah, they're like that. It's okay. We'll just keep marching on. So I found that aspect of it quite interesting and challenging as well. Like, if I was in that position, would I? Probably wouldn't. Even though sort of gone through incidences of racism, would I step up and talk about them so openly? I don't think I would. So I think he's very brave for doing that, particularly in that type of very old school, old boys network kind of setup.
I wouldn't say challenging as such. Coming from a background that I have, reading books that predominantly are trying to tell me that I've got privilege. I found that a bit difficult. Yes, there are people with privilege, and nowadays you can look at people from all angles, not just white. But I've never come from a place of privilege, and I've never come from a place of wanting to hate somebody just for the sake of hating them because they're different. So for me to read that, I find that hard in some ways, because I've never thought like that. Yeah. But I know it's from the basis of those that do think like that and have, really tried to put power over somebody because of it. And there are things that have happened that we should never forget. But we've also got to learn, well, how have we built from that, and what's changed since that, and how can we still keep moving forward. So,
I suppose that with the privilege concept, that the way it's used kind of it expands on what we traditionally think of as privilege as just like financial or status, to be something as simple as
walking down the street.
Yeah, and who's looking at you while you're walking down the street and what they're thinking.
Yeah, because obviously some people will walk down the street and it's very clear there is a difference to, say, somebody else walking down the street, i.e. because of colour. But then you've also got the aspects, when you throw in other aspects like the LGBTQ, I know what that's like just on that basis, because of going through hate myself for most of my life. So it's just the intersections of everything. So but it's where people have, well, I don't understand you, so you're wrong, and that's where a lot of this comes from.
So relating to certain incidents he had highlighted about the law and order in America, how they treat the white people and black people. Simply the fact that you are a black person, right, like driving a good car, is a good enough reason for the police to stop you and then question you and search you and all that. So these I have not experienced. Of course, I've seen them in movies, and I thought maybe they're just movies, they're stories, But when he had written those experiences and said, okay, he had a lot of questions. Still, his mother was like, okay, no, you have to go to church on Sunday, you have to pray, you have to commit, and you have to think about your, spiritual life as well. So, a lot of questions.
So I left the UK 12 years ago, and I feel that there's been a definite shift since I've come back. And I think that's kind of the momentum at the moment is of a society that is attempting, or pockets of it are attempting to address this. Whereas my experience from before leaving was just like, yeah, they're not interested. They don't think it's an issue. It's our issue. It's not their issue. And I've come back to find a society that's like, actually, we might not know what we're doing all the time, but I can see the difference from just a decade ago. And I don't know whether that's COVID or Black Lives Matter or whatever else has happened in the last few years, but I definitely have seen a difference from being here, being away from 10 years.
I think because I've lived for so long not particularly looking at somebody and thinking, oh look, there's somebody over there that's a different colour or whatever, because to me that's just a given. We're more multicultural than ever these days, which I think is a good thing. But it's kind of made me remember that not everybody thinks in that way. And what would I then do if I saw that? And it's, have I got the confidence that I would say something against somebody else, saying, being racist or whatever? And I'd like to think that I've got that confidence in me that, yeah, I would.
So when I read this from what he has explained, what has happened to his life and what he sees and stuff like that, what I understood was like, okay, it's not just what I have to face right now, or maybe just one incident of my life, it's like a whole journey. So that kind of helped me to, I would say, to develop my faith a bit more as well. Because when I look back at my life, the certain incident that I had to go through, and then, because especially when I read a book, if it's like a storybook or something, I finish it in one go. But this I couldn't, I had to stop, and there were literal moments, I had to look back at my life and then kind of understand. Maybe there were instances I kind of figured like, okay, so this is what I mean by this. So it was not just one incidental thing. It's a whole journey, I would say. So that perspective is a good learning for me. You don't look at things at the surface level. You need to kind of, see through things. And also another important message is, okay, you can't always judge things from your perception. You have to always look at things at different, angles. Because if I have not seen what you've gone through, I don't know, my judgment on you will highly likely be incorrect, So that's a good learning for me.
So this is quite a working class community that, for quite a long time were, even though they're very proud of being a working class community, there's quite significant periods of history where they weren't benefiting from the fact that they were working class. So they've had to kind of fight and sort of liberate themselves in a way with theology. So I think for me at least, there should be a natural empathy or affinity with the struggle. I find it challenging when people can understand sexism, but they don't understand racism. And you're like, but they're the same principles. But if you can accept one, then you surely should be able to recognize there's a possibility of the other. So if you can accept the oppression of somebody because they're working class or classism, you should be able to understand sexism and you should be able to understand racism because they're all the same kind of underpinning principles where somebody's oppressing another or someone's exploiting another, in an unfair way. So for me, that's what the theology really, or the messaging across the theology should be able to bring out. But it's also very hard to... Empathy is a funny thing. We can empathize about one thing and then not empathize about the same thing the next day. So it's a tricky one.
I think with Dudley being as multicultural as it is, I like being in the street I'm in because there are so many different people, from black, Asian, you've even got your Latvian, Polish, do you know what I mean? And so you've got so many different cultures, and yet you can see out in the street if something happens, we're all there chipping in, and that's how it should be. And I think this is what this is trying to say to people. You know, we're all here, and that's how it should be.
Dudley's, Dudley, Blackie, they're known as Black Country. So because I learned it's because of the industrialization that was there and a lot of other things. And on top of that, I think there's quite a number of black people here as well. But this is not about Dudley, this is basically about American, theology, black theology. So I think even in terms of Dudley, because of the history about the industrialization and then what they had to go through, could be that they would have had hardships. But I think most of them are converted Christians who come to church on time and then who have their own prayer times. So I assume, so compared to a lot of us, because even if I think about my relatives and my friends back home, I would say black people are kindly committed, strong Christians even than us, because could be because of what they've gone through in their life, or could be with their upbringing. So considering all of that, I would say even in Dudley, they would have had like a good journey.
There's a specificity about the African Caribbean experience, which is different from the African experience. And there's also a generational difference. So the experience of someone who came in as a migrant is very different from someone who's born here and had to kind of go through the system from birth. And there's these nuances that differentiate groups on opinion, but interestingly, the entire group is kind of treated in the same way, as if there aren't those kind of nuances and differences. And I think it'd be interesting to see how my question is, how is the Church of England going to address this? Because the demographic of the Church of England has changed. Anglican Church is a lot bigger, as I understand it, outside of England than it is inside of it, within England. So how is that sort of bigger voice externally affecting the internal construction or configuration or institutional decision making of the Church of England? And I can see how sort of, if you're born into that system, how that sort of changing demographic can feel quite threatening. And understandably so, but at the same time, as a Christian, how do you overcome fear? And that is through love.
I kind of have a question, like at times it talks about, creating a relationship and then facing your hardships and then coming out of it saying, okay, you have to look forward to a lifetime of work and your relationship with God. But at the same time, it talks about suffering as well, and it also says who's blessed in our physical lives will basically will be the last when it comes to God, right? So some of these things I have some questions about, how to understand it or maybe how to interpret it. But this book helped me a lot in terms of getting there. But still I have some questions, It's a really good book, but I love if it is longer than this. Like, I feel sometimes some of the topics have been touched and not described in detail. So if those were also kind of described, because author has sometimes said okay, he's going back to a certain topic, he doesn't have like time, or could be that it's about the length that he's talking about, that he's basically switching from certain topics to other topics. So those, if they would have been a bit lengthier, I think it'd be better,
And he also spoke about other voices within the clergy and the diversity of voices amongst black and brown clergy, because you can have people who are very ready to talk about it, and then you have those who are like, no, let's not rock the boat, because the subliminal or the secondary impact of them raising their voice is felt on them as individuals. It's not something that they're just spouting their opinion and nothing happens afterwards. There's a repercussion that happens. So he did very well in sort of talking about the differences within black and brown clergy and their opinions, which, like every group, is a diverse group. So
if you haven't read from this perspective because you feel you don't need to, I would urge you to at least read one of them to see it from somebody else's viewpoint.